In fact, the actual report was something of a disaster for the FBI. That was obvious to anyone who actually read it.
Everything we have been reporting for years was dead-on accurate. We were right every step of the way.
In fact, the report, as I mentioned to Hannity, is a devastating indictment of our FBI and our intel gathering apparatus.
So, if you watch Fox News, as you saw last night, they were doing a victory lap after the Inspector General's report on the FBI's Russia investigation was released. Now, this may shock you, so sit down, but none of what those talking heads said is actually true. And their hero, the president, he, believe it or not, even went one step further than them.
They fabricated evidence and they lied to the courts. And they did all sorts of things to have it go their way. This was an attempted overthrow, and a lot of people were in on it, and they got caught.
And as usual, the Attorney General, the top law enforcement officer in the country, William Barr, he defended the president.
The real meat of Horowitz's work and the real thrust of the report actually deals with the conduct of the investigation, where I think it quickly became apparent that it was a travesty. And there were many abuses.
Now, this is probably the right time to show you what the report actually said, because it is not what you just heard from the talking heads, the president, or his de facto personal attorney, the Attorney General. The Inspector General, who is an apolitical appointee, released his 435-page report yesterday, and I will read the biggest takeaways from the document itself. The FBI had an authorized purpose when it opened the probe to obtain information about or to protect against a national security threat or federal crime. We did not find documentary or testimonial evidence that political bias or improper motivation influenced the FBI decision. No bias. That shoots down two of the Trump narratives. It wasn't a witch hunt, as the president keeps on saying, and number two, it was not driven by some political motivation here or a hatchet job. But it's only fair to note, the report also showed that the FBI made some mistakes during this investigation. It spelled out that there were problems with the way that the FBI obtained warrants to conduct surveillance on Trump campaign aide Carter Page. The report identified several inaccuracies with the applications, which in effect inflated the justification for monitoring Page. But to reiterate, the report said that the probe itself was justified and politics had nothing to do with it. The FBI Director Chris Wray, a man who I should remind you was appointed by the guy called Donald J. Trump, our president, the FBI Director defended the report and his agency during an interview with ABC News.
As far as you know, based on the findings in the Inspector General report, is the FBI, was it part of some deep state?
Well, I think that's the kind of label that is a disservice to the 37,000 men and women who work at the FBI, who I think tackle their jobs with professionalism, with rigor, with objectivity, and with courage.
Was the launch the origination of the FBI probe into Russian interference involving U.S. citizens lawfully authorized and pursued?
Well, I think it's important for the American people to know that when the FBI opens an investigation, it does so with proper predication, with proper authorization, based on the law and the facts and nothing else. And I think it's important that the Inspector General found that in this particular instance, the investigation was opened with appropriate predication and authorization. The Inspector General did not find political bias or improper motivations impacting the opening of the investigation or the decision to use certain investigative tools during the investigations.
Now, the FBI director, Mr. Wray, also called out elected leaders who are spreading misinformation when they talk about things like the deep state.
When you see politicians pushing this notion, are you concerned about that in terms of its impact on the American public?
Well, look, there's all kinds of people saying all kinds of things out there. I think it's important for the American people to be thoughtful consumers of information, to think about the sources of it, and to think about the support and predication for what they hear.
So the president, hearing what the FBI director, his second FBI director, had to say, he decided to respond via what else but Twitter. I don't know what report current director of FBI Chris Wray was reading, but it sure wasn't the one given to me. With that kind of attitude, he will never be able to fix the FBI, which is badly broken despite having some of the greatest men and women working there. We're now joined by former CIA officer Jack Rice. A lot to pour over this, but it was, if you want Exhibit A for me, Jack, as to how siloed we've become as a public and how everybody gets to make up their own sets of facts. You turn on a certain somewhat fair and balanced news channel, they're telling you that, you know, this is kumbaya, that the coup and the deep state has finally been exposed. The president said that just that, there was an attempted overthrow of the government. The attorney general not only defending what the president said, but continued this false narrative that there was bugging and wiretapping and surveillance of even the president himself, or at least the implication that there was. Listen, I get some talking head saying it, but for the president and for the attorney general, after the IG comes out with this report, to parrot it the next day, I don't know why I'm surprised, but I guess I still was today.
Well, you know, I appreciate the question. I really do, because what I'm struck by, and I read the report, I realize that some didn't, I did. What we have is this, is we have people who are simply misusing the facts. There are objective facts in this case. We can choose our opinions. We can't choose our facts. They are what they are. And the report came out very clearly. The IG report came out and said there was no conspiracy. The problem is we are siloed. We are siloed to the point that anything that is objective no longer exists if it's not convenient for us. The problem that we have right now is that there was no secret overthrow of this president. Despite his language, he's using this from the Oval Office. The Attorney General, who is not the president's personal lawyer and has continued to act like it, frankly should have recused himself from the argument, because before he became Attorney General, he was very, very public, parroting the very same language. And so the fact that an objective report by the IG comes out that undercuts everything that he himself said from his own people, it's a really disturbing situation that we're in right now, when we can't actually say A is A and B is B, and then we can actually dig into it and determine what we need to do. We're not even doing that.
And there was a lot of other things, Jack, came out of this idea that the Steele dossier was basically the linchpin to everything. It wasn't the determining factor in launching this probe. In fact, it wasn't even used for that. And Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, if you listen to the president when he did his breathless reenactment of a phone call or whatever, or a text thread that they had, they weren't major players in this. Comey had to testify. Lynch had to testify. Yes, they screwed up on a few things, but by far in the main, this thing was run the right way and for the right reasons.
I would agree with you. And remember, I'm thinking about this as a former CIA case officer, but not just as a former CIA case officer. I'm a former prosecutor. As a criminal defense attorney, I've taught rule of law all over the world. And there are certain things that we have to approach. We can disagree on a whole series of things, including policy, including implementation, and even standards. But what we do have to accept is there are certain objective truths, certain objective facts that are in place. And the vast majority of the information that was addressed here was addressed and then mischaracterized by the president, by the attorney general. And it is very, very clear here that the reason this was started was because of language used by one of the president's associates speaking to a foreign intelligence source. And that was one of the ambassadors from Australia. And that was the starting point, the linchpin that drove everything forward. That was objectively true. There were objective follow-ups, and it was reasonable based upon the IG's decision that this was something that the FBI should be doing, They should have done it if it were happening before the last president and the next president. But what we're seeing right now is a president who attacks Justice Department, attacks the FBI, calls them treasonous, goes after the Pentagon, goes after the intelligence community, goes after anybody and everybody because it's either fodder or traction for him, or he takes advantage of the situation because, again, it benefits him. It's tearing the country apart. And that's something that we can't have because we have to objectively stand up for our people. When they screw up, it's important that we acknowledge it. But if you tear them to pieces for your own benefit, and that's what I'm seeing, this is something that is difficult and very, very harmful to the country and really our standards for rule of law around the world.
Jack, to me, I almost expected from the president at this point, and I know there's a lot of examples why I, again, shouldn't be surprised, but what happened to Bill Barr? I know a lot of folks when he was going up for confirmation that worked with him as federal prosecutors, and they said, listen, agree or disagree with his politics, you know, he knows the law, brilliant guy, etc. But, I mean, with what he did with the Mueller report, what he has done here, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later in the program, the speech he gave to law enforcement that if you're not showing the respect, don't even... What is going on here with this? I heard Joe Scarborough today saying you ought to be disbarred for these kind of comments, and he's our AG. He knows better.
Yeah, when you look at what he actually said about people who don't, quote unquote, support police officers and the idea, well, they may actually not get services from those officers. I'm sorry, that's an un-American statement. We have to realize who we are. And it is amazing when you look at what Bill Barr stood for, really his entire career. And yet what his behavior has done is he has become nothing but a political. And what's really unfortunate here is that if you're going to be the U.S. Attorney General, you have a very specific job. And your job isn't to simply walk around behind the president and carry his bags for him. This is about standing up for the United States of America. And what I'm really, really afraid of here is, again, as we started this conversation, this undercutting what we're seeing of the idea of rule of law, the undercutting of the idea of what an objective fact is, but the undercutting of what we fundamentally believe in. And I remember sitting in the bowels of the Central Intelligence Agency, raising my right hand and swearing an oath. And that oath was to the Constitution of the United States. The Attorney General had to swear the same oath. By the way, the President had to swear the same oath, or at least close enough to it. And it's not about serving anybody else. It's about serving the document itself and what we aspire to be as a country. What I'm seeing is not just a fraying of that document, but the ripping up of that document. And that is a terrifying situation.
Final question, and this has really been for the better part of 3 years. I can imagine what it was like as a former agent at the very beginning of the administration, the highly partisan address the president gave, and behind him, the stars of the fallen CIA agents who gave their life in service to this country. But the continuous attack on all the intelligence agencies, if they don't support a narrative that's not based in fact, and seemingly, with the exception of the FBI director who spoke up today, so many others not speaking up for them. And even with, you know, on the Foreign Service side, State Department officials looking to Pompeo, basically turning his back to him. The one thing hopefully people took from those hearings beyond the testimony was we should feel good as a country with some of those people in the front lines, the Ambassador Taylors, the Yovanovitches, so many others of these people. But they're under constant assault from, and they do it not for a lot of money. They're serving the country and they're being attacked for their service.
When you walk into the old headquarters building, on the right-hand side, there are carvings of stars in the marble walls themselves. Each of those represent the life of a fallen officer. Many of them don't have their names attached. These aren't famous men and women. These are simply people who decided to give their lives for their country and to do what was necessary in the support of that country itself. What we are seeing right now are more than 37,000 members of the Justice Department who stand up every day, some of whom have lost their lives in the line of duty as well. And they're not stars, they're not famous, they don't make a ton of money, and they sometimes sacrifice everything. To watch any politician use those people as traction is something that makes me want to vomit. It's something that makes me never, ever forget what it is that we do and why we do it. And yet it's one of those things that makes me really concerned, because the more we make this a political question, the more likely we're going to see fewer and fewer people with the qualifications and capability that we have seen stand up in front of Congress and simply tell the truth, and then being attacked through Twitter. That's not who we are, and we need to remember who we are.
Jack Rice, I really appreciate tonight. Again, thank you for your service and your time this evening.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. When we come back, a tragic reminder about gun violence in this country playing out in our viewing area tonight. And we have police chiefs who are dealing with this each and every day. And one of them in Texas has had enough. He's calling out the NRA directly, and even Republican leadership in Washington. We'll show you what they said after this break.